A couple of years ago, I went to Rome, and at the Fori Imperiale, I saw this beautiful fresco showing how the Romans used to make their bread back in the days of the Roman Empire. It immediately sparked my interest. And when I returned home, I started experimenting with different types of ancient Roman bread. Over time, I tried to perfect the recipe and the technique so that I could bake something that would be as close as possible to what we see here in this fresco. It was not an easy task, because in order to get there, I had to learn a lot of things. So today I'd like to share with you the most important lessons that I learned on my journey to mastering the art of ancient Roman bread. The first thing that I noticed is that unlike modern flour, ancient Roman flour was not milled superfine. Instead, it had seeds in it. So if you want to experiment with ancient Roman bread yourself, I recommend that you find a local mill that can freshly mill your grain for you and ask them to leave some seeds in the flour. This will make your life much easier. Otherwise, you can try to find whole grain flour, which still contains the seeds. But that might be harder, depending on where you live. I wanted to make a sourdough, so I ground some spelt with the seeds in it, and then I put it in my mixer with some water and I started kneading it. However, after a few minutes, I realized that the seeds were creating quite a bit of problems. They were getting stuck in the dough and making it really tough and rubbery. To solve this issue, I added some oil, which helped a lot. In fact, the Romans didn't have any other kind of oil except olive oil, so I use extra virgin olive oil for this recipe. Oil also adds flavor, so it's a good idea to add it, even if you do, and have trouble with the seeds. After kneading the dough for a while, I left it to rest, covered it, and let it rise during the night. The next morning, I divided the dough into smaller pieces, rolled them out, and made sure to tuck in the edges, so they wouldn't shrink too much in the cooking process. Then I left them to rise again until they doubled in size. After that, I boiled them for a minute on each side. The step is optional, but it will give you a golden crust when you bake the bread. Also, it will make the bread last longer, because it cooks the outside so the inside stays soft for longer. After boiling them, I put them in my Dutch oven and sprinkled them with some flour. This is another thing that I learned along the way. The Romans didn't have any kind of oven like we do today. Instead, they baked their bread in a very rudimentary oven called a dobu or duban haro, which looked a bit like a big clay pot. It had a small fire underneath, and the bread was baked with the embers from that fire inside the pot. I replicated this type of oven by using my Dutch oven. And in order to replicate the embers, I used some baking embers. With all this set up, I put the lid on top and baked the bread for 40 minutes. At the end of the cooking time, I took the lid off and baked it for another 20 minutes, so it would get a nice golden crust. When it came out of the oven, it looked great, but it wasn't what I was hoping for. It tasted bland, and the texture was dense and tough. So what was wrong? Well, one problem was that I used just regular water. According to what we know, the Romans used to use rainwater. Rainwater has a different mineral composition than tap water, and that affects the pH level, which in turn affects the gluten development. Since rainwater is more acidic, the gluten strands don't form as much, and the dough is easier to work with. You can buy rainwater harvesting barrels online and collect rainwater, but that is not very practical. What I do instead is I use distilled water, which has a similar pH level as rainwater. Another thing that I learned is that the ancient Romans used to add the leavening agent to the flour instead of the water. I'm not exactly sure why they did this, but I think it was because they wanted the bread to rise slowly and be nice and airy. This is the reason why I prefer making my sourdoughs with the sponge method, where I first activate the leavening agent, and then I add the flour and the water. The leavening agent is full of gas, so when I add it to the flour, those air pockets remain in the dough, making it light and airy. In this case, I use my mother culture, which is a natural sourdough that I keep in the refrigerator. If you don't have a mother culture, you can make one from scratch by adding flour and water in a jar and leaving it at room temperature. Since I wanted my bread to rise slowly, I refrigerated the dough overnight. The next day, I took it out, cut it into smaller pieces, and let it rise at room temperature until it doubled in size. Then I rolled it out, tucked in the sides, and put it in my Dutch oven. One thing that I did differently this time was that I sprinkled some salt on top of the bread before putting it in the oven. Salt not only enhances the flavor of the bread, but it also helps preserve it for longer. The Romans probably got their salt from their garum, which was a kind of fish sauce. Nowadays, we can get sea salt, which is pretty similar to what they used. This time, I also added some rosemary to the dough, which was a common practice among the ancient Romans. They also used to add other herbs and spices depending on what was available. With this new dough, I repeated the same process of baking it with the Dutch oven and baking embers. This time, I got a darker crust, which looked very similar to what we see in the fresco. But once again, the bread didn't have the right texture. It was still dense and hard. At this point, I was starting to get desperate. I had spent so much time and effort into this project, and I didn't want to give up. So I decided to do some more research, and I found out about something that would change everything. The ancient Romans used a type of wheat called farum. Farum is an ancient grain that is no longer grown nowadays. But fortunately, I found a website where they sell grains from all over the world, including farum. I ordered some and waited patiently for it to arrive. When it arrived, I replaced the spelt with the farum and ground it with the seeds. This time, the dough was much more elastic and didn't have any seeds stuck in it, so I kneaded it for a while until it became smooth and even. I left it to rest, and then I let it rise slowly in the refrigerator during the night. The next day, I took it out, cut it into pieces, and let it rise until it doubled in size. After that, I rolled it out, tucked in the sides, boiled it for a minute on each side, and put it in the Dutch oven with baking embers. I sprinkled some salt and fresh rosemary on top, and then I put the lid on and baked it for 40 minutes. After that, I took the lid off and baked it for another 20 minutes. When I took it out of the oven, I was amazed. It looked almost identical to the bread in the fresco. But would it also taste good? Well, let me tell you, it tasted delicious. It had a golden crust and a soft and airy crumb. It wasn't dense and heavy anymore, but light and fluffy. The addition of the farum made all the difference in the world. I'm happy to say that with this recipe and technique, I was able to achieve something that was very close to the ancient Roman bread that I saw in the fresco. It was a long journey, but it was worth it because now I know how to make something that people from the Roman Empire would recognize. But it's not just about the recipe and technique, it's also about the story behind it. By learning how to make ancient Roman bread, I also learned a little bit about the people who lived in those times. I can imagine them grinding their own flour, kneading their dough, and baking their bread in their rudimentary ovens. And I can almost hear the sound of the grinding of the seeds as they go about their daily lives. In this video, I only talked about the technical aspects of making ancient Roman bread, but there's much more to it than that. There are many stories and myths surrounding ancient Roman bread, and it's an important part of their culture. It's a symbol of their ingenuity and their ability to adapt to different environments. The Romans were known to be some of the best bakers in the world, and their bread was famous throughout the empire. They were able to develop new techniques and tools that allowed them to produce large quantities of high-quality bread, which was essential for feeding the growing population of Rome. One of the most interesting things about Roman bread is that it was more than just a food. It was a symbol of power and wealth. The emperor was often depicted as the provider of bread for the people, and the distribution of free bread was one of the ways to control the population. During the Roman Empire, bread was so important that the price of bread was used as a measure of inflation. When the price of bread went up, it meant that the economy was in trouble. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and check out the video where I talk about the Roman concrete.